All right, well, I guess we can get started. Thank you all for joining us as we pivoted to an online format this week. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker today. Dr. Adam Hanieh is Professor of Political Economy and Global Development um, oops, at IAIS, University of Exeter, and Joint Chair in Middle East Studies at the Institute of International and Area Studies at Tsinghua University, Beijing, China. His current research focuses on oil and capitalism, energy transitions, and the political economy of the Middle East. Professor Hanieh has authored 5 books, the most recent of which is Crude Capitalism, Oil, Corporate Power, and the Making of the World Market, which came out in 2024. His third book, Money, Markets, and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2018, and I actually cited a lot in my own work. It was also awarded the 2019 British International Studies Association International Political Economy Group Book Prize. Before joining the faculty at University of Exeter, Professor Hanieh was a professor of development studies at SOAS, University of London, where he taught for 10 years. He was a founding member of the Center for Palestine Studies and was active in the London Middle East Institute. He also served as co-chair of the SOAS Center for Migration and Diaspora Studies between 2018 and 2020. Finally, he is a board member of the Middle East and Research Information Project, MERIP, as many of us know it, based in Washington, D.C., and a research fellow at the Transnational Institute, TNI. His talk today is titled Greening the Gulf, ? Renewables, Fossil Capitalism, and the East-East Axis of World Energy. Join me in welcoming Professor Hanieh.
Thank you very much, Naga. I'd like to just begin. Let me just share my screen. Okay, is that okay? Yeah, I'd like to begin by thanking Nagar, Alison, Julia, and all of you for being accommodating, allowing me to do this online and turning up today. It's a real pleasure to be able to speak. The last time I was actually in the US was at a visit to Princeton just before the pandemic began. So I remember that actually very vividly. And I hope sometime in the near future to be able to see you in person. As Naga mentioned, I'm going to be speaking today around the questions of energy transitions and particularly questions of renewable energy in the Gulf and the place of the Gulf in world oil. I'm basing this talk on my new book that Naga mentioned, which is called Crude Capitalism. And I just wanted to begin by speaking a little bit about the book and kind of how the approach I've taken in this book is, and then move on to some of the questions around the Gulf and renewables and oil. So the book attempts, as you can see from the title, attempts to place oil in the history of capitalism over the last 120 or so years, to look at the way in which oil and the emergence of oil as the principal fossil fuel in the middle of the 20th century, around the time of the Second World War, was connected to the making of the world market, in particular the emergence of the United States as the dominant global power, and to try to situate that in the various characteristics of our social system, the various characteristics of capitalism, in particular, the tendency towards ever accumulating growth, endless accumulation, and looking at the ways in which oil facilitated those logics of capitalism and was bound up with the rise of the United States and the current moment of relative decline in American power, which I'm going to speak to a little bit more today. So these are the chapters, just to give you an idea of what the book, how it is structured. It covers various geographies. Obviously, the United States oil industry plays a big part in this. It's particularly in the early history, the Middle East and the Gulf region in particular, particular, and the big seven Western oil companies known as the Seven Sisters, the forerunners of the big Western oil majors that we know today, like ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and so forth. I spend some time in the book looking also at Russia, both at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, the place that oil played in that moment of 1917, but also oil's place in the decline and collapse of the Soviet Union through the 1990s and through to the current moment with the rise of Putin. So these are the various. I'm obviously not going to speak to all of this today, but just to give you an idea of some of the work that is covered in the book. Today, what I will speak about is the Gulf, and in particular, I want to look at begin by discussing the nature of the global oil trade today and the place of the Gulf within this. There's been obviously a lot written, and I'm sure everyone in this meeting is aware of writing on the importance of the Middle East, particularly the place of the Seven Sisters, the role of the Middle East in enabling Western Europe after World War II to be part of that coal to oil transition that had begun much earlier in the United States. But oil supplies from the Gulf, also from Iran, from Iraq, playing a major role in fueling this transition from coal to oil in around the middle of the 20th century, and the initial domination of the Middle East oil resources by those big Western oil firms, and we've seen a lot of writing, obviously, on this question. I just wanted to highlight one point, though, which I'm going to come back to later, which is this question of transition, what it means to talk about energy transitions, because we speak very often about this coal to oil transition, the rise of oil as the leading fossil fuel, displacing coal around 1950. However, that language, I think, is a bit problematic, because what it tends to imply, at least in the kind of colloquial understanding of it, is that oil replaced coal, supplanted coal as an energy source. But in reality, if we look at energy transitions under capitalism, what we notice is very clearly that it's not a question of one energy source replacing another energy source, but actually being added on top of pre-existing energy sources. So the coal to oil transition didn't see a decline in coal production. Rather, it saw oil added onto coal, while oil's share in primary energy grew dramatically from the 1950s onwards. So did the absolute production of coal. So last year, for example, we can see that the amount of coal consumed globally was at record levels. Similarly with natural gas, similarly with oil. So energy transitions are not replacements, but actually additive processes. So this is an important point when we're thinking about this question of the green transition and the emergence of renewables in particular. So I'm going to come back to that point a little bit later. One of the things that is also really important to understand, and one of the arguments I try to make in the book, is that we need to move beyond thinking about oil simply as a source of liquid fuels, liquid transport fuels, and actually think about what oil becomes as it's refined and as it circulates through our economies and our daily lives. So a big emphasis in the book is actually about the importance of petrochemicals and plastics in cementing this emergence of oil as the leading fossil fuel. If we look around us today, and in the rooms that we're sitting, basically all of the products that envelop us, our clothes, the nylons, the synthetic fabrics, the carpets, the paints, all of the plastic products that are around us are products of oil. These are hydrocarbons. They're produced from refined oils, and these petrochemical products, again, emerged and became ubiquitous in the middle of the 20th century, but were very much bound up with the rise of oil as the leading fossil fuel, because what that petrochemical transition did was it made a byproduct of the refining process into a useful product, into able to be used into the manufacturing of plastics, fertilizers, and other synthetic products. So this question of petrochemicals and plastics is really important to understand, because it is seen by the oil industry today as basically the lifeline of oil. And again, I'm going to come back to this point in relation to the Gulf. The other part of thinking about oil beyond simply a liquid transport fuel is the way in which oil and the sale of oil was connected to the huge financial surpluses, which we know as petrodollars, and the ways in which petrodollars were and are connected to the global financial architecture, in particular the US dollar as the dominant reserve currency, as well as the making of US centered financial markets. Again, that's a question that's important to think about today with the rise of China, and it's something that I speak about in a bit more detail in the book. So the key point that I want to kind of emphasize today is that over the last 20 years, we see two key trends emerge within the Gulf in connection to oil. The first of these is the rise of big national oil companies. Obviously, this began with the nationalization of oil through the 70s and 80s. But today, the national oil companies, or the NOCs, that are headquartered in the Gulf region, in particularly Saudi Aramco, are by far the largest oil companies in the world. Saudi Aramco's profits, for example, from last year exceeded the combined profits of the five largest Western supermajors, ExxonMobil, BP, Chevron, Shell, and Total Energies. Those companies, those Western firms, their combined profits were less than the profits of Saudi Aramco. And this is mirrored elsewhere in the Gulf, obviously in the UAE with the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, ADNOC, and elsewhere. So these national oil companies have emerged as major players in the oil industry globally, and they have kind of followed the history of the Western companies in that they have diversified downstream. In other words, they are no longer simply producers of crude oil. They're active in the refining process and the production of plastics and petrochemicals. Further downstream activities, they control huge tanker fleets, pipelines, distribution networks, service stations, and all of these various infrastructures of oil beyond simply the upstream extraction of crude oil, which is what they used to do in the early days of nationalization. They have become vertically integrated and large diversified firms. So that's the first important feature to understand about the changes in the world oil industry over the last 20 years. The second very important characteristic of the global oil industry is the emergence of what I call the East-East hydrocarbon axis. What I mean by this is that the Gulf monarchies' oil exports no longer flow to Western markets, Western Europe or the United States as they used to. Today, they flow predominantly eastward. They flow to China and into wider East Asia. And I'm going to look at some statistics around this in a second. So we see this eastward shift in the Gulf's oil exports that is not simply about crude oil. It also involves refined products, including petrochemicals and plastics that now flow eastward rather than westward. And then associated or another kind of feature, which I'll turn to a bit later, is the rise of the renewables industry in the Gulf states as well. So just to look at some of these points in a little bit more detail. This table you can see looks at the share of world imports, crude oil imports over the last 20 years. And here we can definitively see how important China and wider East Asia has become to the global oil trade. In the early 2000s, United States and Western Europe were responsible for about 50% of the import of crude oil globally. Today, we see China is around a fifth of world crude oil imports going to China, and then if we add in Japan, South Korea, and other East Asian countries, it rises to about a third of world oil is now flowing eastward. Now, this rise in China's oil consumption is obviously connected very much to the industrialization, China's emergence as a major manufacturing center globally over the last 20 years. And it meant that we didn't simply see a shift in the oil, but actually an absolute growth in global oil consumption, which was equivalent to about the emergence of a new United States entering oil consumption globally. So this is a principal reason why oil consumption has grown inexorably over the last 2 decades, making up now, as I mentioned earlier, the largest oil consumption ever in history last year. So the rise of China has not only driven an absolute growth in oil consumption globally, it's also been associated with this eastward shift. And about half of China's oil imports come today from the Middle East, primarily the Gulf monarchy. Saudi Arabia is ahead, as well as Iraq is an important part of those oil exports eastward. And it means also about 70% now of the Middle East's oil goes to China and East Asia. So we can see this quite dramatic shift eastward. Now, what I'm saying here is not meant to imply that the big historically important and decisive Western oil firms like ExxonMobil, like Chevron, like Shell are no longer important. They clearly are important, but their activities tend to be centered on North America, in particular Canada and the United States, and more broadly through the Americas. And then we, as one kind of zone of global oil production and consumption, and then the second really being this east-east hydrocarbon axis that I've spoken to. Now, this rise of the East, if you like, in global oil is what has driven very much the downstream diversification and the growth of these national oil companies, especially Saudi Aramco, which has kind of led in these crude oil exports, but also become diversified into downstream activities. So if we look again at refining capacity, and this I think is a really important metric to consider, because it really crude oil is not a useful product until it's been refined and turned into something else, another fuels or petrochemicals or other kinds of products. And this table looks at the share of refining capacity globally. We can see that around over 40% in the early 2000s of global refining was located in North America and Europe. Today, there's been, again, a significant shift here. We can see that China and the rest of the other East Asian firms make up a very significant proportion, essentially displacing the kind of Western dominance of refining capacity. The only other region of the world where refining capacity has increased in the last couple of decades is the Middle East. And in fact, if we looked at these statistics today, we would probably find that Middle East refining capacity exceeds that of Europe. So we see, again, very much associated with the emergence of China as a major center of capital accumulation, of manufacturing, the rise of large refineries, which either refine Middle East oil and turn it into fuels and petrochemicals, or refining that happens in the Middle East, and then those refined products tend to be shifted or exported eastward. So, thinking about this in a little bit more detail downstream, we can see here the global trade in basic plastics. So these two basic plastics, ethylene and propylene, are often referred to as the world's most important chemicals. The kinds of products that I referred to earlier, the plastics and synthetic fibers and so forth, are basically products of these two chemicals. China is by far the largest importer of these basic chemicals, and you can see, looking at this table, that the biggest kind of share of China's imports again come from the Gulf of these two chemicals. So this is what I was referring to earlier about the downstream diversification of the national oil companies like ADNOC, like Aramco, who refine their crude oil supplies and then turn these into these chemicals, and then then export them to China and the wider region. So we can see the Gulf is now playing a very central role in the global plastics trade and the wider petrochemical industry. So looking at this, these kind of east-east links in a little bit more detail, we can see that we have the vertical integration that I spoke about. Aramco, for example, is no longer just a crude oil exporter. It owns it in a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, it took over SABIC, the Saudi Arabia Basic Industries Company, which is around about the third biggest petrochemical company, one of the biggest producers of ethylene in the world. Is now a subsidiary of Aramco. ADNOC, similarly, has engaged in this kind of downstream diversification, involvement in fertilizers and other kinds of products. Saudi Arabia, in particular, is leading is at the leading edge of some of the developments in the petrochemical industry. In particular, these kind of new technologies called crude oil to chemicals, which are basically refineries that can take crude oil and convert it directly into petrochemicals. And this, they're building actually the largest of these COTC complexes, which is expected to launch in 2025. So these products are intended towards export to China and the wider region. Aramco is very explicit, as are other oil companies, that petrochemicals in this respect are the future of oil. While they may see the like a leveling off of demand for liquid fuels, they very much see the rapid growth and continuing growth of plastics and petrochemicals. And Aramco is aiming for about 40% of each barrel of oil to be used in petrochemicals in the next over the next decade. So we can see very much the kind of strategic orientation is into these plastics and petrochemical industry, which obviously carries with it very significant environmental consequences, questions of microplastics and so forth that I'm sure everyone is here aware of. I'll come back to this question of the climate and plastics in a second. So looking at this east-east hydrocarbon circuit, I've been at pains to stress that this is not simply the export of crude oil, it also involves refined products. It also has seen very deep interdependencies forming through foreign investments between both China and the Gulf monarchies. So we see, for example, these companies that are listed on the slide here, these Chinese petrochemical firms, these are privately owned Chinese companies. Privately owned petrochemical firms in China make up about 30% of China's petrochemical production. And these are the largest of those privately owned petrochemical firms in China. All of them have a significant share of their ownership controlled by or owned by Gulf-based national oil companies, in particular Saudi Aramco. So we see here these interdependencies forming where the Gulf national oil companies are directly invested inside China's petrochemical production. So directly involved in the kinds of manufacturing circuits in China and direct ownership, not simply the export of crude oil, but directly involved in the production of petrochemicals inside China itself, which is really important, I think, to note. And as I've been stressing, this is not simply a factor that involves China, it also involves the wider region. South Korea, for example, S-Oil, which is the third biggest refiner. It's currently building the world's largest petrochemical steam cracker, S-Oil, in South Korea. S-Oil is a subsidiary, fully owned subsidiary of Saudi Aramco. So what we normally think of as being a Korean firm, and to people in Korea, S-Oil appears as a South Korean firm. It's actually a Saudi firm, and it's deeply involved in the production of these very central chemicals and expanding rapidly. Hyundai Oil Bank is similarly, it's not a subsidiary, but it has a large part of its ownership shared with Gulf NOX. In Malaysia, the biggest petrochemical plant currently being developed is a joint venture with Petronas and Gulf national oil companies. In Japan as well, we see these Japanese refiners that are partly owned by Gulf national oil companies. So we see, in other words, this direct investment inside these petrochemical and other oil circuits in China, East Asia, and vice versa. So we see very heavy involvement of Chinese national oil companies and South Korean firms in the oil circuit in the Gulf as well, whether it be refineries, whether it be drilling projects, and so forth. So there is deepening interdependencies between the two regions that reflect very much this eastward shift in the Gulf's oil exports more generally. And I'll come back to this in a second. The question of renewables is very much part of this. So this East-East hydrocarbon circuit is, I think, a very important feature to note. Now, turning to the question of renewables, all of the Gulf states, without exception, have made it very clear that they don't intend to move away from the production of oil and the export of oil, and also of liquefied natural gas, LNG. Obviously, Qatar is one of the major producers of LNG globally, but also Saudi Arabia and the UAE have earmarked very significant expansion of these of gas as well. In fact, the Saudi oil minister a couple of years ago said in an interview that every molecule of hydrocarbons will come out. So there's no they're not hiding the fact that they intend to accelerate the expansion of the fossil fuel industry. However, at the same time, the Gulf is also moving quite rapidly into solar and wind expansion, in particular solar. The solar schemes. And in fact, the Middle East, led by the Gulf, is the outside of China, was the fastest growing renewable region in the world in terms of renewables capacity last year. Now, this is starting from a low base, admittedly, but this sector is expanding in the Gulf. The largest single site solar plant is now located in the UAE in the world. The biggest battery storage plant under construction is in Saudi Arabia. It's a joint venture with BYD, the Chinese EV manufacturer, and Saudi Aramco. So you see expansion of solar capacity at the same time, and wind, but particularly solar. Now, why is this the case? How do we kind of reconcile this apparent paradox? On one hand, these states very explicitly say they're ramping up fossil fuel production, but at the same time, they're also expanding renewables. And the answer to, or the way of I think answering that again was stated quite explicitly by the Saudi oil minister a couple of years ago, where he spoke in reference to this apparent paradox about the triple win. What he meant by this is that they saw renewables as bringing three key advantages. The first of these is that the Gulf monarchies are among the highest consumers per capita of electricity in the world, partly to do with the industrialization that I spoke about, the growth of refining capacity, etc., but also obviously with air conditioning and dealing with the impacts of the climate change. So the first win that he's referring to here is the shift to using renewables as a way of increasing electricity consumption, because in the Gulf, the majority of electricity by far is through oil and LNG and natural gas. So with the minor exception of the UAE, which has some nuclear capacity, most of the electricity production in the Gulf is taking place at the moment through fossil fuels. So they seek to cheapen the cost of electricity production by bringing in the capacity of renewables. Now, that's the first win. The second win, obviously, is that they can say, the Gulf states can say that we are leading the world in terms of renewables. We're meeting our climate targets. The ambitions around electrification, renewable electrifications, is quite substantial in the Gulf, exceeding the EU in some respects, in some countries. So they can say we're meeting our climate targets, we're part of this so-called green transition. And then the third win, which is really the key point here, is that by shifting electricity production to renewables, they hope to free up the more oil for export. And again, very explicit about this, that instead of consuming it at home, it can be sold abroad, particularly in Eastern markets. So in this sense, they speak of this triple win. So looking at these projects, I think is really important because it shows that there is no contradiction between the turn to renewables, the expansion of the renewables industry, and the continued accelerating production and export of fossil fuels. There is no contradiction between these. It's an additive process that we see. So there's something I think we can learn about the green transition, or this so-called green transition, from the vantage point of the Gulf. And it's quite, to my mind, quite striking that so much of the discussion around these environmental questions basically ignore the Middle East and ignore the Gulf. They tend to be centered on Western Europe, China, and North America. If we look at the renewable projects that are rolling out in the region, it's interesting also to look at the ownership of these projects. And here it's very clear there's a couple of features of these projects. Number one, there's the heavy involvement of the national oil companies in the ownership of some of these solar and wind projects and battery projects that we see in the region. So there's deep linkages with the oil industry in the Gulf, where the oil industry is actually owning and building out this capacity. The second thing that's very revealing about these projects is that there is a heavy involvement of Chinese, South Korean, and Japanese, particular China, in the ownership and operation of these projects. So I mentioned BYD as an example. In the UAE, there's a lot of there's a big Chinese firm, the world's largest manufacturer of solar panels, Jinko, is Chinese. It's jointly owning a lot of the renewables projects in the UAE and Saudi Arabia, not just in terms of the manufacturing of panels, but also the running and supply of electricity from these schemes. It's interesting to look at Aqua Power, which is a major Saudi renewable. Well, it's a major Saudi power firm. It's involved in renewables as well as fossil fuel production. Outside of Saudi Arabia, Aqua Power's kind of subsidiary that's active in the other parts of the Gulf, as well as places like Morocco, Jordan, and elsewhere, is jointly owned. It's a subsidiary that's jointly owned with a Chinese fund called the Silk Road Fund. So again, there is, when we talk about these East-East connections, it's not simply in hydrocarbons, it's also now evident in the renewables sector. So I think this is a very interesting feature to note. As I've just mentioned, in terms of Aqua Power, we can see that these Gulf-based renewables firms like Aqua, Masdar in the UAE is another example, are also internationalizing in the wider Middle East. So a lot of in fact, the majority of the kind of renewables capacity, solar in particular, outside of the Gulf region, is actually owned by Gulf-based firms. So it's, again, it reflects this kind of internationalization of Gulf-based capital through the region. Very importantly, associated with this renewables expansion, the Gulf is playing a major role in terms of climate policy. globally, as well as climate financing. We saw this obviously in COP28 in Dubai, which was chaired by Sultan Al Jaber, the head of the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, also the head of Masdar, the renewables solar panel solar company that's leading many of the projects in the UAE. So the Gulf is really, I think, a major site in shaping the trajectories of climate policy globally, and also in the rollout of some of the false solutions we see. Carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, I think, are two clear examples. The biggest carbon capture plant is being constructed in Saudi Arabia, and also hydrogen is a major is also earmarked in Saudi and elsewhere in the Gulf. So just to wrap up in the last 5 minutes or so, I just want to turn to some of the political and policy implications of this eastward shift and the rise of the national oil companies. This graph that you can see on this slide, I think, is quite telling, and it really speaks to that point that I was speaking to earlier around the nature of energy transitions as being additive and not replacements of energy sources. We can see, firstly, 1950, that mid-20th century moment where there's this massive expansion in global oil becoming the leading fossil fuel, the orange color you can see in that graph. But alongside continued growth of coal, and then in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the increasing production of gas as well. So really, globally, if we're looking at oil, for example, there's only been around 4 moments in the last 80 or so years where there's been a global decline annually in oil production, and each of those moments have been associated with major global economic downturns, like 2008, like COVID, and in particular, the biggest one actually was in the early 1980s, the 1980s recession. So in general, energy transitions are additive, and we can see this is very much the case in terms of adding on the renewables capacity in the Gulf and elsewhere. The other side to this, and I'm happy to speak much more to this in the discussion, is the place of the Middle East in American global power. Very important part, obviously, of the 20th century history. And I would say today, because of these East-East links that I've spoken about, and the kind of growing interdependencies between China and the Gulf monarchies, which is evident not just in the oil sector, not just in renewables, it's also evident in AI, real estate, and other kinds of economic and political sectors as well. What the US is attempting to do is, I think, knit together its historic alliances in the region, in particular Israel and the Gulf monarchies, promoting very heavily, we can see this today very evidently, is the normalization between the Gulf states and Israel. And I think what this is very much bound up with is an attempt by the US to reassert its primacy in the Middle East by bringing together these historic allies, in part in response to this relative decline in American power and these East-East linkages that I've spoken about in some detail. So the US is absolutely attempting to pull the Gulf away from these ties with China, and bring together, normalize the political and economic and diplomatic relationships between Israel and the Gulf states in this respect. The final point I briefly mentioned this is the question of climate and the very evident and accelerating climate emergency that we're facing. The role of the Gulf states in shaping the trajectories in my opinion, very harmful directions. Through COP28 and also COP29. One of the distinctive features of these big Gulf-based national oil companies is that they are not, they sit on the same page with ExxonMobil and the Western oil super majors in terms of attempting to derail or divert any kind of effective climate policy into these false solutions like carbon capture to allow the continued expansion of fossil fuels. They have the same kind of discourse around this as the Western oil companies. However, what is distinctive about the Gulf national oil companies is because of their very close connection to the Gulf state, they actually have a seat at the table when these policies are being developed and rolled out. So, for example, I think a very clear really important example that didn't get the coverage it should have was the negotiations around a global plastics treaty that took place in South Korea in November last year. So this treaty was meant to basically, there was a lot of hope in this treaty that it would put a limit on the production of plastics, which is accelerating at very dramatic rates. About half of all plastics ever made were made in the last 20 years. And the levels are increasing of these products. So this global plastics treaty was meant to put a limit on global production of plastics. However, that treaty was stymied, and in particular, it was stymied because of Saudi Arabia, who blocked any kind of treaty, and they did so using a very kind of revealing slogan, which was the problem, according to Aramco, the problem with plastics is pollution, not production. So they've attempted to kind of disconnect the relationship between the oil industry and plastics, disconnect the fact that this is a question of fossil fuel production ultimately, and just turn it into a question of pollution. So I think these kinds of things are quite revealing because we see the ways in which the Gulf states actually are at the table when these kinds of treaties and negotiations are being negotiated. And there are many other examples we can speak to here. I'm happy to talk more in discussion. So just finally, if you are interested in getting a copy of the book, there is actually a discount code here which is crude, and you can order it from Verso Books with that discount code and a 40% off. But thank you very much again for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to discussing more any of the questions that might have arisen from this presentation. Thank you. I'll stop my sharing here.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Professor Hanieh. I have many questions that I want to ask you, but I'm going to give our participants the chance to ask the first ones. If anybody wants, they can do the raise a hand function, or you can write the question in the chat and I can read it aloud. So does anybody have a first question? Go ahead, Bita.
Thank you so much for this. This is not usually what I think about, so I really appreciated it. I want to give you space. You said you want to talk a little bit more about the place in the Middle East in terms of U.S. global power, so I want to give you an opportunity to talk about that. And then also maybe a rudimentary question. how do you think tariffs are going to play out with all of this? So I guess those are my two questions for you. Thank you so much.
Should we take more questions?
We can
Yeah.
field a few questions if that's more helpful. Go ahead, Chair
Yeah.
Gin. You're next.
Hi, thank you so much for your fantastic talk. Yeah, I'll be the one who, I guess, asks this. If you could position Iran anywhere in these statistics that you mentioned of the East-East connections, how much has their production essentially trickled to uh, essentially what is the level of trade in terms of petrochemicals and oil, refined or unrefined, between Iran and other East Asian countries. Also, this might be a cynical approach in terms of you mentioned that the Gulf states are also funding a lot into renewable energy, such as solar panels. But I think you partly mentioned it as well. How much is this just as a show for quote unquote climate global goals, especially since solar panels themselves are very much not environmentally friendly, and the amount of resources that it takes to produce them, water, as well as not being recyclable, that you simply have to dump them and there's nothing else you can do with it. And uh, thirdly, I was wondering if you could speak on a little bit more about how oil is simply being added to existing productions of coal, specifically because if we think of European coal production, especially during the 1950s and 1960s, there were vast protests toward the import of coal into the import of oil into Western Europe, specifically oil being advertised as this clean energy. Essentially, it's a clear uh, type of liquid as opposed to coal with its image of dirt and soot and all that. And workers protest against this. So clearly there is not direct overlap, but there was, I believe, a reduction of coal use, especially in Europe as well. Or are you talking about more a global consumption of coal?
Adam, do you want to take those two? Because there are
Sure.
actually several questions in there, and then we'll
Yes.
go to Julia, and
Sorry, my
there's also a
fault.
question.
No,
There's
no.
also a question in the chat, so I'll let you break it up a little that way.
Okay, great. All right, let me speak firstly to Beta's questions and the Middle Eastern. Yeah, I think it's very clear that if there were, and obviously we're living in a moment of extreme chaos, and it's very difficult to predict where things are going. But I do think if there was a moment of or heightened conflict between US and China, which appears to be the direction we're moving, then the place of the Gulf within this will be very important. The Gulf monarchies will be very important in this, not simply because of these exports, the hydrocarbon exports that I've spoken about, which are really crucial, obviously, to China's capacity, industrial capacity. China needs these imports, and there's nowhere else it's going to be able to get these imports from. But it's also really important, I think, at the financial level. If there were going to be sanctions on China, then China would need to be able to buy its oil in other currencies than the US dollar. And it has tried to this has been a big emphasis in terms of China's negotiations with the Gulf monarchies around buying oil in RMB. Now, this is a complicated question because it's not like the Gulf has a stake in the US dollar, because so much of the Gulf's wealth is invested in US dollar assets and in US markets. So it's not a simple relationship here. I think it's very revealing that Saudi Arabia, despite being invited to join BRICS, hasn't done so. Even though it was supposed to, and I think there is clearly an attempt by the US to think about the place of the Gulf in any kind of future conflict with China. So yeah, that's why I think this question of normalization is really so much on the table. It's obviously not a new question. It's been around since the 1990s, but it is something that is accelerated both with the Abraham Accords, but also in the current moment around So yeah, the question of tariffs. Yeah, I am not. It's a difficult question. I think my reading of these tariffs. I think there is if you look at some of like Scott Bessent and Stephen Moran, the chair of the National Economic Council, and kind of the way they're writing about this prior to the current moment, in the lead up to the elections. And they did quite clearly lay out a strategy which appears to be what is happening now in terms of tariffs, in terms of forcing other allied states, whether they be in Europe or in the Gulf or Israel, to take a greater share of kind of the defense costs, to kind of lower the US dollar, but at the same time keep its status as an international reserve currency. So I think, to my mind, that's the kind of strategy that they're following. Now, whether that will be successful or not, whether it's going to detonate some kind of bigger financial problem in the bond market or elsewhere, is the big question of the day. And I think there's a lot of people who think that might actually be what happens. So, but I do think, again, the question of the Gulf monarchies is really, and it's very clear the way that the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia in particular, is really prominent in a lot of these the writing about the global economy and US power by these individuals in the Trump administration. It's really interesting. So yeah, on the questions around Sharagim's questions, Iran, yeah, Iran is very important, and obviously China diplomatically had played that role in the kind of reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and I think that's another example of where you see this kind of growing influence of China in the region. However, the relationship with China and Iran, China is a major supplier. It's, I think, about 30% of Iran's trade is with China or something. It's really dominant partner in all of this. However, from the Chinese perspective, Iran is not that. It's 1% of China's trade. I think it's very small. So I think there is this kind of connections with the export of crude oil, but there is a refining capacity. But my understanding is that because of the sanctions, there's a lot of investment needed in the Iranian industry. I'm sure people in this meeting could speak to this much better than me, in terms of the impact of the sanctions on kind of refining capacity and those kinds of things. Yeah, the renewables. Yeah, I mean, the questions you raised about, I do think this is not just greenwashing. I don't think it's they're just saying this to pretend that they're doing this. I do think there is a real question here about electricity, and the very high levels of consumption of electricity in the Gulf monarchies, and the attempt to move away. I mean, electricity in most places globally is not today fueled by oil. Burning oil. It was at some point in the middle of the 20th century. In some Western European countries, oil played a big part in kind of electrification, but it's quite at odds with the global trend, which tends to be around LNG, which tends to be around gas and hydropower, to see electricity production fueled by oil. But in the Gulf, that is the case. In Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, very significant proportion of electricity is actually oil-based. So I think there is a genuine attempt to replace some of this so that more oil could be used elsewhere, whether it be refined products or crude oil exports. But the question of the wider region, the points you raised about the ecologically damaging aspects of these projects are very important to consider. If we look, for example, at Morocco, you can see one of those firms I mentioned earlier, Aqua Power, has expanded into production of solar in Morocco, and they are, it's connected to displacements, land displacement, water resources, because as you point out, big solar farms require a lot of water and chemicals to kind of keep the panels clean, especially in harsh environments where there's a lot of sand, etc. Land ownership questions, people getting evicted from land and displaced. So these are really important questions to think about, particularly because a lot of in some of these areas in North Africa and in particular, some of these electricity renewable schemes are connected to Western Europe's energy consumption. It's not about electricity consumption in these countries, but the export of electricity to Europe. There's a very good book that talks about this in some detail, Dismantling Green Colonialism, by released last year. It's an edited collection of questions looking at kind of green schemes in the region. So yeah,
Can we skip the third? Sorry, can we skip the third question and
sure,
make sure that the other people?
Yes, sure.
There's a question in the chat from Hanieh. She says, super interesting. Thank you for your research. In my work, we are increasingly concerned with the human element of the energy transition, the ideas of environmental justice and energy burden. Do these topics also emerge in this geography? How are states engaging with it? And then Julia, if you want to ask your question, and we will wrap up in 5 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, there's thanks so much, Adam. There's so much, always learning so much from you. I have many things I'd like to ask, but not for here. Just one, I want to ask you to, just kind of thinking back connections to some of your earlier work, like in globalization of capital moving into Egypt and buying up, when you've shown how public sector companies were being purchased and the transformation of the political economy there. I'm just curious if you have anything to say about hydrogen also, because it was on one of your slides, which has been pushed a lot in Egypt. And then just a note, I don't know if people are keeping track while they're listening, but Trump just announced a 90-day pause on what I don't think we can call them tariffs. I mean, I'm with the people who say it doesn't make sense to call this tariffs because there's no coherent tariff theory involved in any of this. And the Dow just jumped 1,200 points. And it's just wild, wacky. But how, there's so much happening that you're tracking with such detail. But I want to pull back just for closing to one of the, the big points that you, as you pull this together, and look forward to hearing more going forward on the shift to South-South and the move to China. So just to extrapolate, do you see this together within, the move of manufacturing out of the West and to China, the factory of the world, et cetera, that this is kind of a long-term secular trend that the Gulf states are playing a key role in, and that this is kind of something that's going to be unstoppable, or how just to extrapolate a little bit more at the takeaways.
Yes. Okay, I'll try to do this very quickly. On the question of environmental justice, I think it's really important to think about this in the context of the wider Middle East region, and some of these schemes that I spoke to really do, I think, point to the burden that is being placed on peoples in Morocco or Tunisia or Egypt, Jordan, where you have these so-called green projects rolling out, often predominantly involving actually Gulf-based firms. In some cases, actually, in conjunction with Israeli investments in Jordan and other places. But the burden of this is actually borne out by people living on the land who are displaced or see rising costs for water or those kinds of things. So yeah, there's a lot to speak to. I don't really have time to go beyond that. The question of hydrogen is really important. I talk about this in more detail in the book because I think it's very clear that hydrogen is another one of these kinds of false solutions that are being promoted by the oil industry. Because there's different kinds of hydrogen. The so-called clean hydrogen is called green hydrogen, but actually the majority of hydrogen is blue hydrogen, which is produced through LNG, through natural gas. And what this means, this is by far the biggest component of hydrogen production, which is quite small, but blue hydrogen is the predominant form. And what this means is that the pushing hydrogen actually is about offering a lifeline to the LNG, to the natural gas industry, which is again mostly controlled by oil companies. So it's about expanding the production of gas, which is another reason why the Gulf states have really put in their kind of strategic development a lot of emphasis on gas production. LNG is one of these gases that was marketed as being clean or as a bridge fuel, but is extremely damaging because of methane. It's methane, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas. The questions around global energy. Thanks for that, Julia. In the sense that I do think it's important to think about these questions globally, and the fact that exports that we might be consuming in places like Europe, or in particular in Western Europe, they probably are being produced in China or elsewhere, Vietnam, elsewhere. Our clothes, the materials around us. So there's no kind of nationally based way of looking at this. We have to think about this at the global level when we're thinking about energy consumption. It may be true that in the UK there is less, coal, for example, but if the goods that we're consuming in the UK are produced through coal-fired generators, electricity in China, the emissions that we're consuming are still coal-based emissions, if you like. So there's no kind of national way of looking at this. So yeah, in the short point, I think though about this kind of shift to China and East Asia and the place of the Gulf is really, really key in this. But it's complicated because of the historic relationships between the US and the Gulf, the US's kind of security guarantee for the Gulf monarchies, as well as the question of the US dollar and the petrodollar surpluses in the Gulf that tend to be dollar denominated. So there is this kind of being pulled in both directions, but the Gulf is really key, I think, to where these trajectories are going to head.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Hanieh. This was such an informative discussion and very timely given all that's happening right now, and helping us think through all of these complex, movements in the energy world. So thank you for joining us today, everybody in the audience, and we will see you in person next week with Professor Dan Tavana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.